So it now looks like it's going to be a very good time to be wearing fancy golden armour in Warhammer 40k. Let's talk about the Adeptus Custodes and why it looks like they're going to be doing particularly well in the new Arks of Omen. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Custodes, and specifically going to be looking at them with regards to all the big changes for Warhammer 40k that have just been happening. In order, we'll talk through their balanced Dataslate changes, how they interact with the new 40k rules in general, their points changes and secondaries, and an overall take. Currently though, my general feeling is that it's looking good for the Custodes. Adeptus Custodes have been doing rather well in tournaments recently, a win rate of over 50%. It feels like they're in a good place to capitalise from all these changes, as quite a lot of the top factions of the game got hit by some very heavy nerfs, where broadly speaking just about everything out of this has been positive for the Custodes. So first up, let's talk a bit more about their balanced dataslate changes. The Custodes have basically two different things from the dataslate. Objective Secured is going to be returning to all the Custodian infantry besides characters, and perhaps even more importantly, the caps on a bunch of really handy stratagems have been lifted, meaning that Custodes as an army are going to be ridiculously flexible. The Objective Secured on the non-troops infantry though, I do think was probably a good change from Games Workshop. When Custodes were doing rather well back in January around a year ago, one of the nerfs that Games Workshop gave them were that the Objective Secured only applies to their troops, and it got taken off the Alaris Terminators and Wardens and Venatari. It meant that all of those units, while they were kind of similar to the Custodian Guard in terms of raw numbers, it meant that they just weren't really taken all that much. As if you have units with a similar sort of combat potential, you may as well take the ones that get Objective Secured, as that's going to lead to a few more points over the course of the game. These guys are kind of receiving a double buff though, as well as being Objective Secured when previously they weren't. Troops choices are no longer going to be mandatory for filling battalions and things in Arks of Omen, so you could build entire Custodes forces based around these powerful elites units as opposed to the standard Custodian Guard. The main units that really benefit from this are the Alaris and Aquilon Terminators, the Wardens, and the Venatari. I'd say currently the Alaris Terminators are probably a bit better than their Forge World counterparts, though the Forge World ones do have some nice strength 10 melee, which certainly isn't bad. I do quite like the Alaris though for being a fair bit cheaper, plus they have those fairly punchy grenade launchers. They seem like quite a good unit for some focus buffs, and they seem pretty interesting as well if you just wanted to run a couple of small units of them for disruption. You can take them in individual 60-point units. Those with Obsec could be really quite annoying, and they could sneak some objectives they might not normally be able to. The Wardens, I feel like they're competing pretty well with the Custodian Guard, provided you didn't want the Presidium shields or anything. They cost an extra 5 points compared with the Custodian Guard with the Spears, and for that price tag they get a 6+ Feel No Pain, which isn't bad, an extra attack, and also the Bodyguard rule to allow them to protect characters even when there's just one model. Overall, for an additional 5 points, I could see those being very usable as a bit more of a staple unit. They do also have the option of axes as well if you want them. Sometimes the strength 8 is going to be better than the AP, but sometimes not. Finally, the Venatari Forge World Jump Infantry I think are particularly interesting. They'll now be very fast moving Objective Secured, so they can bound up the board behind cover potentially. They may be a little bit less threatening to heavy hitters and things, but they'll still maul medium infantry pretty nicely between their pistol shooting and their combat. Previously I felt that most people were generally wanting to take the Virtus Praetors instead of them. Now these guys have Objective Secured, I feel like it's going to be a bit more balanced on that front. Overall I feel like this is quite a nice win both in terms of power and flavour for the Custodes. A bunch of units that were kind of overlooked before becoming a lot more relevant. I consider all of these pretty safe competitive choices now, on a similar sort of level to standard Custodian Guard, who still have their advantages. The other major balanced dataslate change though was the stratagem change. Previously in those prior nerfs, Games Workshop had basically restricted Esteemed Amalgam, Emperor's Auspice and Martial Discretion all to be one-use only stratagems, and I'd say that this was really quite a big power cut to the Adeptus Custodes, as between these three they just basically give you a dizzying array of options for how you can augment the Custodes and have the exact right buff on the unit that you need it. That can sometimes be fairly devastating. Going through them in turn, Esteemed Amalgam is the one for the Emperor's Chosen that allows them to borrow another shield host's fighting style for a bit. This one gives them a ton of different options, access to special rules like full reroll wound rolls against characters from Shadowkeepers, that's pretty good if you're fighting a powerful one, fall back and charge if you need it, pretty handy if you've got say a jet bike captain in combat, and the ability to ignore modifiers for a turn if you want to. For 1 CP it's just very usable, and there's going to be all sorts of situations that's going to be great in. I feel like this probably means that Emperor's Chosen are going to get even more further ahead compared with the other shield companies. They're already the most commonly played, I feel like that's only going to get more so now this is de-restricted. Otherwise the Emperor's Auspice is also great. An infantry unit gets to turn off enemy rerolls, a huge deal against some armies, say for example Space Marines with multiple overlapping characters. I guess in particular if Space Marines start spamming Plasma Inceptors or something, then you might be able to make a fair few more of them detonate by using this. For 1 or 2 CP there's also Martial Discretion as well. This one is almost similar to the Esteemed Amalgam as well, in allowing you to manipulate your martial Katars. 1 CP for small units and 2 CP for bigger ones. All game access to this plus Esteemed Amalgam just means that a Custodes unit can just flex into a crazy amount of special rules if they need them. The Katars can give you some nice options like say the double shooting weapons with Salvus, Rendax if you want to put the SPAC down on say an Imperial Knight perhaps, or a chance to prevent fallback with Captaris. That could be pretty game changing if it stops your unit getting shot and gets an enemy unit killed. Overall, between the 3 of these, I think it's a pretty good power boost to Adeptus Custodes. If it doesn't make sense to, you don't have to invest any resources in any of these, but if you have an enemy where it just makes sense to repeatedly use one over and over again, you can really double down on that and say keep on turning off rerolls for an army that absolutely relies on them. I feel like the flexible rules are also going to really reward people who know the Custodes tables of rule benefits inside and out. It's going to be a game of picking the best benefits as the game goes along. The balanced Dataslate is far from the only thing that's going to be changing for the Custodes and Arks of Omen though. I feel like a few other things are going to make things better or worse for the Golden Boys. First up, Armour of Contempt being gone is quite a big deal. It's also doubly interesting as it's looking like Space Marines are going to be pretty strong in this update, and Custodes generally do quite well against them, having a whole load of damage to weapons, high AP ones in combat, but even the AP-1 Auric weapons are going to be a lot more savage at deleting Marine bodies now they don't ignore the AP. I guess, judging by the Space Marine rules, the Marines won't be too bad at killing Custodes either, with lots of high strength and high AP weapons coming at them. It'll be interesting to see who gets the upper hand in those particular fights. Broadly speaking though, having an army that you're good at killing being one of the stronger factions in the game generally doesn't seem like the worst thing. Armour of Contempt going will certainly punish other rivals though, like Chaos Space Marines and Sisters of Battle, so she'll be a decent leg up on those kind of armies. Next up, the Arks of Omen detachment is perhaps one of the biggest shake-ups to the game. I'd say maybe it's not going to impact Custodes perhaps as much as some armies, generally because Custodes don't have that many units on the board due to being so elite, so we're usually fairly comfortable to fill up battalions and things, and not really feel the pinch on their slots too much. I guess just theoretically there might actually be some decent competition for the elite slots available for the Custodes, and I wouldn't be too surprised if Custodes wind up building around the elite section of the Force organisation chart. Their Forge World Dreadnoughts, like the Galatus and Achilles, are both very powerful. A lot of lists have been running a whole load of those, and now a few lists might prefer things like Alaris and Wardens to Custodian Guard. Those slots just feel like they're going to be under quite a lot of pressure. Otherwise though, I guess new options are being able to double up on Biker Shield Captains if you want for 1 CP. Could be interesting enough to have a pair of fast-moving fighty characters working in concert, but I feel like you would get into some slightly diminishing returns. You can't take Tip of the Spear twice, and the first one will get the good Warlord traits and things like the 5+ Feel No Pain. Otherwise, free strategic reserves might occasionally be useful. Could be interesting enough to say just throw a flanking Dreadnought into strategic reserve for some disruption, or have a unit of Custodian Guards turn up on the edges just to annoy the enemy and get into a better position. Probably not something to go wild on though. I guess if you're playing mass Dreadnoughts or something and you're not able to hide them all, again that could be a reason to put a few of them in strategic reserve. Otherwise though, I feel like something that will impact Custodes lists a bit might be the thought of bringing some knightly allies along. You'd now be able to take command point free Armiger Helver and Free Blades as an allied choice, and they just seem to be really quite a good fit for the Custodes army. A fast-moving, general-purpose firepower unit with damage 3. It's perhaps a slot that would generally be taken up by Caladius tanks, which are absolutely fine, but I feel like the Armiger Helverins might just get the edge over them a bit because they have 5 model objectives secured, which the Caladius tank doesn't. It means they can actually be quite good for last-ditch efforts to hold on to some objectives or contest some midfield ones, whereas the Caladius doesn't have Obsec and only counts as 1 model. I strongly suspect to see at least some Custodes lists running those. Points changes, and the Custodes got a few little ones, basically the changes to their Sisters of Silence units, the Prosecutors dropping to 11, and the Witch Seekers and Vigilators dropping to 12, losing 2 points. I guess if you want to add in some cheap units to do some actions and hold objectives and things, then this doesn't hurt. I do quite like the idea of including, say, 1 or 2 Sisters of Silence units within a Custodes army, as you could play them quite differently depending on whether you're against Psykers. If you're not against Psykers, they can just be completely expendable or grunt units to hold objectives. If you are against Psykers, they could be more prominent, Maybe shield your army from a turn of a barrage of smite from some Zoanthropes or Thousand Sun Psychers perhaps. Out of the three, the Prosecutors will get objective secured, which is handy if you just want to use them as grunts. They won't be needed to fill mandatory detachment slots anymore though in Arks of Omen, so I feel like they've gained some reasons to play them but lost others. Out of the other two, I feel like perhaps my favourite are now the Witch Seekers, 12 points to upgrade them to some D6 shot flamers with AP -1. Now AP-1 is actually pretty relevant against Armour of Contempt armies. The Witch Seekers do seem to be a pretty interesting choice. If you just wanted raw damage, then I think it easily makes sense to pay the extra points to upgrade to Witch Seekers or Vigilators. I guess the question is whether or not you're willing to give up the objective secured for that. I still rank the Vigilators as probably the most niche. Custodians have a whole ton of mid-strength damage 2 weapons, and the Vigilators just don't feel like they add a whole ton on that regard. For objectives in the Arks of Omen mission pack next, and the Custodes secondary objectives just didn't really change at all. I'd argue that the Custodes unique secondaries were generally quite bad across the board, and I feel like if Custodes had been doing a bit worse in tournament games, then Games Workshop would have buffed them. Seeing as they still have a win rate of over 50% despite these though, I feel like Games Workshop decided to leave them alone. Maybe not the worst idea in the world if they were giving them extra buffs like the Stratagem revision and Obsec and stuff. In any case, the Custodes objectives are unchanged. Auric Mortalis to kill the biggest enemy unit, very usable but high risk whether or not you do it or not. Might of Terror is the one to kill enemy units but lose none yourselves. I think that one's pretty dreadful to be honest. Unless you're playing a very one-sided game, you're going to be losing units. And Stand Vigil is the weird one for the mid-board objectives. You need to hold more than your opponent at the end of the battle round, and it just means that it's fairly doable if you're going seconds, but very hard to achieve if you're going first. Seems a bit dumb to have an objective that's radically better or worse, depending on the chance of going first or second. Overall, I feel like they're generally going to be wanting to fall back on the book ones as much as possible. Maybe not the worst changes there, as a few of them got a bit easier. It's a little bit easier to do things like behind enemy lines and engage on all fronts, and a few of the options have the chance for troops units doing them to gain some command points for their army. Maybe not terrible for the Custodes, as their Custodian Guard are fairly effective troops. Overall, I'd say it's probably a small buff for Custodes on their secondary game. The book ones got a bit better, and they do have a few other usable objective secured units going around, I suppose. Overall though, as mentioned at the start, I do feel that Custodes have come out of this really quite well. As mentioned, they were already doing kind of fine in tournament games, an upper mid-tier army that had been winning a few events, a win rate over 50%, and basically it's almost nothing but good news out of this update. The nerfs to the stratagem has been taken more than once. I think it's a surprisingly big power boost to the army, more than it sounds. Objectives secured on those units are helpful enough, as are the small points cuts to the Sisters of Silence units if you wanted to take some. Otherwise, big nerfs to the other top factions will certainly allow them to beat things like Harlequins and Tyranids a lot better, and a bunch of factions losing Armour of Contempt is good for them, and Marines being strong again would generally be good seeing as they're not too bad at killing them. In terms of impacts on Custodes lists from these changes, I suspect that even more people than ever will be taking Emperor's Chosen, with Esteemed Amalgam being more usable. It's already very good regardless, seeing as you get the better feel no pain against mortal wounds and the single rerolls, which are quite powerful when you're hitting on 2s. I'd expect to see Knight Helverins being cropping up in competitive lists. Their objectives secured and pretty decent firepower, and I'm going to guess that we'll see a few less Caladius tanks as a direct result of that. Armies could certainly build to play around with those stratagems a bit more now they're no longer one-hit wonders. You could take big units to make use of Esteemed Amalgam or the various different flexible options, and you could actually have that as part of a game plan, as opposed to something that's a bit more opportunistic on small units at the moment. As mentioned before as well, I suspect that maybe the Elite Detachment might be the way to go for Arks of Omen. I'd guess that those slots are going to be fairly full between their Great Forge World Dreadnoughts and the Alaris and the Wardens being better. Maybe Fast Attack could be another option with Venatari and Virtus Praetors though. In any case, largely good news for the Golden Boys. Let me know your thoughts or how you might adapt your list going forward into Arks of Omen. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics as well. I'll certainly be aiming to get a video of this out for every single faction in the game. Going to be interesting to talk points and rules updates for all the 40k armies. If you want a bit of an overview though, then feel free to check out my big Arks of Omen review video. I've linked that down in the video description, going blow by blow through the points changes and balanced Dataslate. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description also. It is the thing that allows me to keep on making these 40k updates all the time. I do try and give some good rewards to the channel patrons, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.